We are back in the book of Hebrews. We're at the end of chapter 8, Hebrews chapter 8. But before we get started in that, I just want to make note of some things about the book of Hebrews. And I have made a list here, and the list is not exhaustive. Every time I go looking into the book of Hebrews, I find that my list needs to be added to. But this is a good start anyway. And the list is this, of how many Old Testament books are quoted in the book of Hebrews, and how many Old Testament books are referenced in the book of Hebrews. And there's a lot. The book of Hebrews is unique. It's unique in that it has certain terms like that of you are a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. That is unique in that it's the only place in the Bible that explains what Psalm 110:4 meant. It's the only place. You toss this book out, you don't know what that means. But it's more than Psalms that it's quoting. And here is, first off, our first list is what is quoted. And once again, there are times I'm reading the book of Hebrews and realize, how did I miss that? And then it will be something I need to add. And it happens all the time. Okay, so these are the books that are directly quoted. We have Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy. Those are directly quoted. That's 3 books of the Pentateuch right there. The first 5 books, we have 3 of those being quoted directly. 2 Samuel, and that's history. That's being quoted. Psalms and Proverbs are being quoted. That's 2 books from what could be called wisdom literature or the poetry, books of poetry. We have Isaiah and Jeremiah quoted directly. Those are major prophets. We have Haggai that is quoted. He is a minor prophet. Then we have those that are referenced, books that have definite references. Joshua, that's a book of history. Judges, also a book of history. Those are referenced of individuals from those books. Daniel referenced that he is a major prophet. Leviticus and Numbers are also referenced. Not quoted, but they're referenced. So that's all 5 books of the Pentateuch are found either quoted or referenced in the book of Hebrews. Plus, every section of the Old Testament is one way or another is included in the book of Hebrews, whether quoted or referenced. The Pentateuch, that's the law. You have history, wisdom literature, major prophets, minor prophets. That's your Old Testament. Every section is represented. And this is one of those things where if you don't know the Old Testament, Hebrews is not going to make any sense to you. Matter of fact, Matthew chapter 1 won't make any sense to you. If you don't know the Old Testament, these things aren't going to make a lot of sense because they're quoting them, referencing them, and using them, and showing, especially here in the book of Hebrews, things that are the shadow or symbolic of what was going to be the greater. You can call it a foreshadowing of the greater, such as with the tabernacle, which is what we're going to be looking at this morning, such as the tabernacle that was God commanded Moses to build, and he built it. That tabernacle is symbolic of the greater, which is the tabernacle that the Lord made. And it's not the one that's on earth or that it's no longer around anymore. Not that one. That one was just temporary. By the reign of Solomon, it's not being used anymore because there is the temple that is there. That for all the work, all the gold, all the things that were in it, it was only a temporary thing. But there is the heavenly. And the heavenly is not Solomon's temple, which was destroyed by the Babylonians, nor was it the later temple in Ezra's day, nor was it the temple complex in the first century that was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. The greater is in heaven. The greater is in heaven, where we have an eternal high priest and someone who brings about a better covenant and better promises. And there we are, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6, and we're just going to look at these verses quickly and go into chapter 9. But Hebrews 8, verse 6, but now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, inasmuch as he is a mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises. Okay, then the writer of Hebrews goes into Jeremiah 31 to 34, direct quote, and it is a message from God through Jeremiah in preparing a people centuries ahead of time, preparing a people for another covenant, a new covenant. And he's very specific so that one could not think, oh, it's a continuation of the covenant we've already had. He's just referring to it as new. No, he becomes very specific. It's not like the one from Mount Sinai. It's not like the one given to Moses. It's not that one at all. This is a new covenant. So it is preparing a people. And that is something the Bible always does. Before it brings about some important thing, some important subject, it introduces that subject earlier. It introduces it. We can look at numerous things in the New Testament of before the church began. We have been introduced to it, actually going all the way, not just Jeremiah 31, but going also in Daniel, also in Joel, in numerous places, in Isaiah. But also Jesus speaking about it, describing it. It's already been introduced, but he continues to teach about it, to continue to introduce us to it in parable form and in direct statements. He did that. And also concerning something like the death of the Messiah. Nothing new. It was not new information when Jesus is suddenly crucified on the cross. Well, that was spoken of in Psalm 22. It's spoken of in Psalm 2. Jesus also spoke of it repeatedly, that he was going to be betrayed. It was going to be the elders and the scribes. It was going to be the court that was going to condemn him to death, and he would die. All right? Now, I am saying all this to reiterate, because we talked about it a little bit last week, to reiterate that the Bible has a pattern, and it doesn't just throw something in all of a sudden, assuming you know what it's talking about. It doesn't do that. Just like with Melchizedek, you are a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Well, Melchizedek was introduced in Genesis 14. That statement, that prophecy was given in Psalm 110:4, and now Hebrews explains what it means. All right? All that, there's a background to it. There's an introduction to it. And then you have the full explanation of it in Hebrews, of which you will not find another explanation of it. There'll not be another explanation. This is it. And this is a pattern that we see in the Bible. And I've done this before, and I'll do it again because I think it's important. there are books that pretend to be from God. The writers of it pretended to be inspired of God. And in those books, we can see where the pattern is not the same. Pattern's not the same at all. Such as the Quran. Last lesson, we talked about the Book of Mormon. But the Quran is very, very guilty of this, of speaking of mandatory things that you are obligated to do, if this is actually from God, things that it's pretending, at least making statements, things that you are to do, and you don't even know if you have not been taught outside of the Quran, you will have no idea what it's talking about. There has to be an outside source to help you. And of course, when Muhammad is giving his statements, and Muhammad didn't write the book, didn't write the Quran. When he's giving his statements, of course, the people he's speaking to, they would already know the language. They would already, and I mean the words he's stating. When it states, and it's not very far in the Quran, when it states that you must pray toward the holy mosque, it doesn't even introduce prayer. Okay, one could say, well, that was already introduced earlier. It doesn't introduce mosque. What is a mosque? That's a completely new word. What is that? What's a holy mosque, and where is it? None of those questions are answered. None of them. It too breaks the pattern. If it's from God, God broke his pattern completely in that, and also the Book of Mormon. He completely broke his pattern. That there is a pattern of introduction, and then explanation, and then further explanation, and then example, both good and bad. You find it all. And something like the Quran doesn't do any of that. It just goes directly, this is what you must do. And if you haven't been introduced by it from something outside the Quran won't tell you. It won't tell you at all. Now, we see here with this Jeremiah 31 to 34, speaking of that new covenant. Now we come to verse 13, so chapter 8, verse 13. In that he says, a new covenant has been made. A new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. All right, if he says there's a new covenant, he's made the first covenant obsolete. We begin again. In that he says a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. It's going away. Now, we know it was nailed to the cross. And we know that at the death of the Christ, death of the testator, that the testament comes into full force, comes into authority. Okay? And of course, the death of the testator is the death of Christ, and his testament, his new covenant, his covenant comes into being, which means everything before it comes to a close. That would be the law of Moses and Judaism, and it would also mean patriarchy, which is what the Gentiles were under. All that comes to a close. And then we have the law of Christ. So there's a new covenant. Jeremiah 31 spoke of it. And so if there's a new, then the old is done away. Now, we go to chapter 9, beginning verse 1. Then indeed, if the first covenant had ordinances of divine service and earthly sanctuary, then indeed, I need to read this with the right inflection. Then indeed, even the first covenant of had ordinances of divine service and earthly sanctuary. That first covenant, it had these things: ordinances, divine service, and there was an earthly sanctuary. And now he's going to be referencing, describing that tabernacle, which is going to be coming from mostly Exodus, but also Leviticus and Numbers. For a tabernacle was prepared, the first part in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer and the Ark of the Covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot of manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. And above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. So he gives an explanation, gives the various things that could be found, not everything, but the various things, various details about that tabernacle. Of course, he's mentioning the Ark of the Covenant. He's mentioning that and describing that in a little bit of detail, overlaid with gold, and you have that of the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat, and the things that were in the Ark of the Covenant, golden pot of manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and a table of tablets of the covenant. Now, I just want to make mention of this, that would be true. Now, he's referencing the things that had been in the Ark of the Covenant, and he's mostly referencing that of Exodus and Numbers in that. But when we get to, and I'm just making mention of this, 1 Kings 8 and 9, and that of Solomon's temple, it mentions there that at that point in time there was only the tablets of stone. That was the only thing in the Ark of the Covenant at that time. What happened to the other two things? Don't know. But they weren't there by the time of Solomon's temple. But he is speaking of going back to that pot of manna that was put into the Ark of the Covenant, and also Aaron's rod. But it is interesting that he gives these details of that earthly sanctuary, and then of these details we cannot speak, of these things rather, we cannot speak in detail. He could have gone on a lot further in this, but that was enough. And this is very similar language to what he says in chapter 6, verse 3. This we will do if God permits. We could give these details. We can go further into these things, and that would be, in chapter 6, it was those foundation stones, those elementary principles in Christ. All right? And he says that this we will do, we'll continue in this if God permits. It's not going to be in this letter. It's not going to be in this book. But if God permits, he did want to visit these people he's writing to. He did want to visit them. But here he says, of these things we cannot now speak in detail. There's no room for it. There's no need to it. Just giving these basic facts, describing a few things, then he can move on. Now we go to verse 6. Now when these things had been thus prepared, the priests always went into the first part of the tabernacle, performing the services. So the tabernacle did have you have the first section there, and only the priests went in there. Only the priests. You have the first section, and in there you have the table of showbread. You also have the altar of incense. Those things are are in that first section. And then he speaks of the second section, that holiest of all, of where there is another veil. And only the high priest went in there. Nobody else went in there. A man who is a priest can go and do his duties in the first part, but he can never go into the second part, ever. Only the high priest can go through the first part and into the second part, and he only did that once a year. That was it. And it was him alone. And the book of Hebrews speaks of that, and we're about there right now, as a matter of fact. But verse 6 again, now these things had been thus prepared. Now when these things had been thus prepared, the priests always went into the first part of the tabernacle, performing the services, but into the second part, the high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance. There was a reason why he went in there, and him alone. And that was, in my mind, a very frightening place. Because it's the Ark of the Covenant, and there is the presence of God between the two cherubims of glory, as the book of Hebrews writes it. The presence of God is right there, and even if the high priest were to touch the ark, he would die. And if someone went in there who was not authorized to go in there, he would die. It's that simple. And that was a frightening place, a place that deserves respect and reverence. That to know where you can and where you cannot go. And while it is true that you have the temple destroyed by the Babylonians and another temple destroyed by the Romans, it was only as God permitted it to occur. And one could say, well, they had to have gone into the holiest of all because they were destroying it. Yeah, I agree with that. Yes. But God had also permitted that to happen. That those things were to be destroyed. And he used the Babylonians and the Romans as the instrument by which he's going to do that. Now, regardless of all that, we come back to this high priest. Then verse 8, the Holy Spirit indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. What's the meaning of that? Well, that's this holiest of all now is in heaven. That tabernacle is, and all the ordinances and all the things of that had to be done away with. The earthly had to be done away with so there could be the heavenly. And this holiest of all that's in heaven is the greatest. There cannot be a greater. It is the greatest. The tabernacle or the temples here on this earth were a shadow. They foreshadowed the greater. And it is that holiest of all in heaven. And this also, if we were to go back to chapter 8, verse 2, it talks about the true tabernacle, which the Lord erected. The true tabernacle. The other was a shadow, foreshadowing the true. Once again, a pattern that, and a very sophisticated pattern, that the Bible has set forth. And this goes all the way through the Bible, and not just concerning the tabernacle, first and greatest. The first one not being the greatest, then the next, the heavenly, that is the greatest. There is more that's found in the Old Testament that foreshadows things in the New Testament. and everything goes together like one may say puzzle pieces or a hand in a glove. It's perfect. It's perfect. Guarantee you, if someone who's never seen a glove could easily know that thing's shaped like a hand. And it looks like you can put your hand in it. And put your hand in it, it fits. And you know, yeah, this was made for a human hand. Same thing occurring with the biblical text in the Old Testament, showing these shadows, showing these foreshadowed things, coming now into what is the true, as 8 and 2, chapter 8 verse 2 says, the true tabernacle which the Lord erected. Okay, the earthly temple, the earthly tabernacle, verse 9. It was symbolic. What is that? That first tabernacle, the earthly one. It was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. So, that first tabernacle, which Moses was commanded to make, that first tabernacle, it is symbolic in this present time. Okay? Now, in this present time, when he's writing this, all that's been done away with, but it's still symbolic. It's symbolic to this day. It's symbolic to the heavenly. It remains as a symbol. Even when it's done away with, it remains as a symbol. Just like so many other things that can be found, that they are symbolic of something even when they've been done away with. Even when it's gone, it still serves as a symbol, as a shadow of the real. Now, notice that those gifts, sacrifices, offerings, verse 9, cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. They cannot make anyone perfect. That's the first covenant. And as we have already read, if that one were faultless, if that one were everything we needed, there would be no need for another one. Nothing. We wouldn't need anything else because that would serve. That would work for us. But we need the better. We need the better covenant. We need the better temple. We need the better high priest. We need all those things. Now, we continue on in verse 10. So it's speaking of those gifts, sacrifices, offerings, concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. Now that term, it continues with, these are the various things that occurred through those ordinances. Food, drink, various washings, fleshly ordinances. That's what they concern. And that would be everything from dietary laws to laws concerning dress to all manner of things, including not harvesting the corners of the field. And all those things would be that of those fleshly ordinances. All right. Now, until the time of Reformation. Now that word, those two words, with three words, time of Reformation, what is that? That is reforming or restoring the way things were supposed to be. Going back to Genesis 2. Genesis 2 did not need a time of restoration because there was no sin in Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 3, all that changed. And you have the promise of the defeat of Satan and sin. And it isn't until we come thousands of years later to the death of Christ that with the death of Christ, there is that time of restoration, that time of reformation. And that word means to make something straight, to take something and order it the way it's supposed to be, or reorder it the way it should have been, or that it used to be at one point. It is to restore something. That's what that Reformation means. And so what's restored? What's restored is a sinlessness that humanity can have. A sinlessness that Christ brought. That Christ brought. Christ brought that possibility for us. Now, verse 11. But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. 8 in verse 2, the tabernacle that the Lord built. The Lord erected that. And here we have this one that is called greater, more perfect, not made with hands. Now that also goes back to some wording in Daniel chapter 2. Something not made with hands. Now there, it was a stone not cut with hands. A stone that no hands touched that. What does that mean? No human hand touched it, which means it's not altered by human hands. It's created by God, and it will not be altered by man. And if God doesn't change it, it doesn't change. If God leaves it alone, then it doesn't change at all. And if it's perfect, then there's no need to change it. Now, I have made mention of this before, and I want to make mention of it again. If something is perfect, it doesn't need anything to make it better, because it works perfectly. And if something is perfect, that means it will work all the way through time and doesn't have to be changed because it's perfect. It doesn't matter what culture it's in, what century it happens to be in, what it happens to be now. It doesn't matter current popular beliefs. None of that matters. None of it alters that which is perfect. That which is perfect runs right through that and continues to be perfect and does precisely what it's supposed to do, always. Now here's a thing about something that's perfect that sort of reference, but now want to be very specific about. When you have something that's perfect and it's new and perfect. But if it's perfect and running through time, there will be a time when it's ancient, but it's still perfect. It doesn't need to change with the times. That would make it useless. It truly would. It would make it useless. If it had to change with the times, that would mean it was never perfect, was it? It was never perfect. If it has to change with the times, how are you going to keep up with it? You'd never be able to. You'd never be able to keep up with that. But if it never changes and it's perfect, that means there'll be times when there will come a time when people will say, "Wow, that thing's old. That was for the first century, not for the 21st century." And here's something I'd like to introduce to you, is that statement, that argument is also an ancient argument. If you're just against things that are old, that argument is old. Okay? You might as well just toss that argument out too, because that argument is a very old argument. You think they weren't saying that in the 5th century? In the 5th century, 1st century would have seemed very ancient. With 6th century, 1st century would have seemed even more ancient. That was 600 years ago when all this came about. If it's perfect, it's perfect. And that's precisely what The book of Hebrews is not alone in this. The book of Hebrews is setting forth that everything in Christ is not only better, it's perfect. Now, let's continue on with just verse 11 again. But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, which the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. Verse 12, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. So, he doesn't have to have this yearly sacrifice for going into the most holy. He doesn't have to do that, because he's going with his own blood. And with his own blood, he can go into the most holy place once for all. And that's it. It doesn't have to have anything else. Now, one's going to ask the question, and we've already answered it earlier, not today, but earlier lessons. One can ask the question, well, what was the point of all the calves and goats? What was all that about if they could not take away sins? It's shadowing of the real. Those were acts of obedience, and those were shadows of what was going, or foreshadowing of what was going to occur. Those were acts of obedience that God expected and demanded, but also as a comparison between what was done back then and what was done by Christ. Christ didn't save us by sacrificing an ox or a calf or a goat. He did it by sacrificing himself. And by doing that, he is a far greater high priest. The other high priests before him under the Levitical priesthood, they couldn't do that. It would be meaningless. They couldn't sacrifice themselves. That would be meaningless, and it would be against the will of God. But sacrificing Christ was not against the will of God. Never was. That was in the mind of God before the world began. That was from everlasting. That idea. That was from points that we can't even imagine how far back that goes. It was always in his mind. And it is done, and with that eternal, truly eternal love, everlasting, everlasting, truly eternal love, he brings about this through his Son, who becomes our high priest at his own sacrifice. Now, let's move on. And let's read verse 11 again, because we need to. But Christ came as a high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. It's not here. It's not earthly. It's heavenly. Not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled the unclean sanctifies and purify for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Okay, here is another thing that Hebrews always does. It's one of its many purposes, is to show that if this were the case back then, how much greater would it be if it's Christ? Just like if the word of angels proved steadfast, what about the word of Christ, who's greater than the angels? What about him? If the sacrifices done in the past were that sprinkling the unclean sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, if that worked, what about the blood of Christ? What about that? How much greater, how much more shall the blood of Christ? Well, yeah, a lot more. infinitely more is what that is. And it's able to cleanse us from dead works to serve the living God. And there are those words again, which we saw back in chapter 6, those dead works. What are those dead works? Well, we can look at truly the Old Covenant were dead works. Were they works? Yes. They've been done away with? Yes, they're dead. They're gone. But there's also another way of looking at it, but I think that is that's a very valid way to look at it. But that of cleanse your conscience from dead works, I think can be something that we need to look at. And that of the dead works in our life, the things that we have done, the things that we should never have done, the sin in our life, that we can be cleansed of those things. Those dead works, they lead to nothing but death. And that we can have that clean conscience from dead works to serve the living God. One cannot serve the living God and those dead works at the same time. Okay? You can't serve God and mammon. You cannot scatter and gather with Christ while scattering abroad at the same time. It's one or the other in this. Now, we go to verse 15. And for this reason, he is a mediator of the new covenant, which Jeremiah spoke of centuries beforehand, by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. Okay. For all this, he's a mediator of the new covenant. He's a mediator. He's between man and God. Nobody else is between you and God. Nobody. There's definitely no human between you and God. And we want to open this concept up that you do not need someone on this earth between you and God. Okay? You don't need a priest. If you're a Christian, you are a priest. You don't need a saint. If you're a Christian, you are a saint. If you are the member of his kingdom, the member of his church, there is no one who is a mediator between you and the Father except Christ. He's the one that adds to his church. He's the one that can, as we see in Revelation chapter 2, he can consider an entire congregation. That's an entire, that would be those getting together. They are Christians, but they're not behaving that way anymore. He can take away that lampstand to where they're not his church anymore. No man can do that. No man can add you to the church, and no man can toss you out of the church. No, you can do it. You can toss yourself out on your own, but no one can do that. Christ has that power, which is good. The one who died for me, the one who loves me, is the same one that died for you and loves you, is the same one that adds to the church. And he's the same one that can say, yeah, this one was called, but not obedient. Therefore, not recognizing them among the saved anymore. The idea of once saved, always saved doesn't work. It's not biblical at all. Just look at the wording in the New Testament, not just a few selective verses. Look at the principles, look at the things that are found in the Bible. And here we have this, that he is the mediator for us. By his death, he is able to do that for the redemption of the transgression of the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance. There is a hope, and it's a powerful one. It's the most powerful one. And it's the one that will be revealed, the one that we will be fulfilled by God when all of this is over. So we need to stop here, and we'll continue next week, and I want to thank everybody for being with us.